The Silent Prison. Willow Creek, Montana, was a quiet town, nestled between rolling hills and expansive farmland. The landscape seemed untouched by time, with endless fields stretching as far as the eye could see. But within this peaceful setting lay a place that had become a symbol of isolation and fear. At the edge of town, hidden behind miles of rusted barbed wire, stood the Mara farm, a property that had been abandoned by the world for years. Hank Mara, the farm's owner, was a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones, rarely in public, but always with caution. The locals knew better than to wander near his land. It was a place marked by rumors, whispered behind closed doors at Betty's Diner, and avoided at all costs. Hank's reputation was as harsh as the unforgiving landscape he called home. And the townsfolk didn't need to look any further to understand that he was a man who preferred solitude, perhaps because it was easier to hide in the shadows when no one dared to see him. What no one knew, what the world had long forgotten, was that within the weathered walls of the farmhouse, a woman named Sarah Mitchell lived, a woman whose life had been reduced to nothing more than an endless series of painful days, trapped in a nightmare she could never escape. 3 years ago, Sarah had been a vibrant woman, a special education teacher from Bozeman, full of life and dreams for the future. She had vanished during a hiking trip in the mountains, and the search parties that scoured the area eventually gave up, assuming the worst. The mountains had swallowed her whole, or perhaps the wildlife had claimed her life. But the truth was far darker than anyone could imagine. Sarah was still alive. She was not a missing person buried beneath a mountain, but a woman broken by years of abuse and isolation. Her body, though once strong, now bore the marks of cruelty, scars that whispered stories of failed attempts to resist. Each day had become an endless cycle of punishment, and Hank's twisted beliefs justified the torment he inflicted upon her. He believed she needed to learn obedience, and his teaching methods were harsh beyond comprehension. Sarah's cries, her screams of desperation, were carried away by the howling winds of Montana's vast plains. The land offered no compassion. It was her prison, a place where no one could hear her pain, and the silence became both her enemy and her only companion. The isolation was her cage, but it was a cage she couldn't escape. She had long given up on hope. Her world had become small, reduced to the dirty mattress on the floor, the bucket that served as her only means of relief, and the persistent smell of fear that never seemed to leave her. That spring morning, however, something was different. It started like any other. The wind howled, the fields stretched endlessly beyond the farmhouse, and Sarah could hear the rustle of the dry grass swaying in the breeze. The familiar silence was broken by the unexpected sound of vehicles, 3 of them, engines roaring as they approached the farm. Sarah's heart raced. She hadn't heard a car on this road in years. She crept closer to the crack in the boarded-up window, her eyes strained to catch a glimpse of the outside world. 3 police SUVs rolled onto the dirt road leading up to the farm, their tires crunching on the gravel. She held her breath. This couldn't be for her. She had long stopped hoping for rescue. The sight of police officers could only mean a brief interruption to her endless prison. But Sarah had never been more wrong in her life. The officers weren't here for her, but something was happening, something that filled her with an unfamiliar surge of hope. She watched in silence as the officers stepped out of their vehicles, their K-9 unit in tow. Among them, one dog stood out, a magnificent black German shepherd. His eyes scanned the surroundings with an intensity that made Sarah's heart beat faster. Unlike the other dogs, this one seemed distracted, nose lifted to the air, catching a scent no one else could detect. Officer Blake Thompson, a 10-year veteran of the Montana State Police K-9 unit, noticed the odd behavior of his dog. "Drake's acting weird," he muttered to his partner, Officer Mia Chen. "Never seen him like this before during a routine exercise." Mia shrugged, but there was a hint of concern in her voice. "Maybe it's just wildlife. A lot of coyotes in this area." But Officer Thompson wasn't convinced. Drake, the German shepherd, had been trained for many years. He knew the difference between wildlife scents and something else. The dog's bark grew more urgent, his tail stiffening. He was fixated on something beyond the fenced-off area, something that drew him closer to the farmhouse. Inside, Sarah's heart fluttered. She could hear the bark growing louder, sharper. She watched the dog's relentless focus, his barks echoing in the otherwise quiet morning. The sound of the dog barking, the first sound of life she had heard in so long, sent a jolt of hope through her. Something was different today. She couldn't explain it, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirring of a feeling she thought was lost forever. Hope. She inched closer to the window, trying to see the officers. Her foot caught an old floorboard, and it creaked loudly in the stillness of the room. Sarah froze, terrified that Hank might hear. But then, something incredible happened. Drake, the dog, shifted his focus even more intently toward the farmhouse. His barking grew louder, more desperate. He was close, closer than she had ever dared dream. Outside, the officers were beginning to take notice. Officer Thompson frowned, studying the farmhouse more carefully. "You live alone out here, Mr. Mercer?" he asked, his gaze never leaving the house. Hank, ever the calm and collected man, gave a nonchalant wave of his hand. "Just me and the livestock," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "Been that way since my wife passed 5 years ago." Sarah pressed her ear against the wall, trying to hear more of the conversation. She had to know. This might be her only chance. She needed to know if anyone could hear her, if anyone could help her escape this place. She watched as Drake's barking grew louder, more urgent. The officers seemed to be growing more concerned. Officer Thompson shifted his weight, glancing at his partner, then at the house again. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't going to walk away without answers. For Sarah, it was the first real chance of freedom she had in years. She had taken a huge risk. She had made a noise, but if it was the right one, if it got their attention, it could be the break she needed. The breakthrough. The wind seemed to pick up as the officers stood outside, their attention fixed on the farmhouse. Every second stretched like an eternity for Sarah as she watched the interaction unfold from the safety of her hidden room. Her body trembled, not from the cold but from the weight of what she was witnessing. Real human voices, the sound of officers working to unravel the mystery of her captivity. It was all so surreal. She had spent the last 3 years in absolute silence, broken only by the cruel commands of Hank Mercer. But now, there was noise, and it was a noise that signified possibility. Drake, the German shepherd, continued to bark, his sound carrying with such urgency that it echoed across the otherwise silent fields of Willow Creek. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off the dog, a living reminder of the world outside the farmhouse. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dared to hope, dared to imagine that this dog, with his powerful instincts, could be the catalyst for her salvation. Officer Thompson, still standing near the fence, could feel something in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that made his instincts itch. He had been on enough calls, dealt with enough situations, to know when something wasn't right. Drake, the K-9 officer by his side, was acting beyond the scope of a typical training session. There was a deep urgency in the dog's behavior that wasn't related to wildlife or the simple distractions of rural Montana. The dog's intense focus on the farmhouse was something Thompson couldn't ignore. As Hank spoke with what seemed like rehearsed ease, Thompson noticed the subtle tension in the man's posture. He was friendly, sure, but there was something about his eyes, something that shifted just enough to make Thompson pause. The man wasn't entirely comfortable. His gaze constantly flicked to Drake, who was still barking relentlessly. Something was off. "Mr. Mercer, your dog is quite focused," Officer Chen said, her voice polite, but there was a sharpness to it now. "You mentioned livestock, but your dog seems to be showing an unusual interest in your house." Hank waved a dismissive hand, his smile faltering for just a second. "Animals get skittish around strangers, officer. He's probably picking up on something. Coyotes, perhaps." But it was clear that the officers weren't entirely buying Hank's explanation. Officer Thompson had been in this business long enough to know when someone was trying to cover something up, and there was something about the way Hank was acting, the tightness in his voice, and his repeated glances at Drake, that made Thompson's suspicions grow stronger. As the conversation continued, Sarah couldn't stop herself from inching closer to the crack in the boarded-up window. She had not heard human voices in so long, and now they were so close, so painfully close. She dared not move, afraid that a single sound would alert Hank to her presence. Every muscle in her body tensed with anticipation. Could this be it? Could this moment finally be the one where her endless suffering would come to an end? The sudden metallic tapping from inside the house startled Sarah. It was faint but distinct. Tap, 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 like a steady rhythm in the silent air. It was a sound she didn't recognize, but it seemed to have the desired effect. Officer Thompson's eyes narrowed as he turned back toward the farmhouse, his gaze sharp. He could hear it now, too. "Mr. Mercer," he called out again, his tone much firmer, "I think we need to take a closer look inside your house." Hank's expression shifted immediately. His calm demeanor cracked, and something darker flickered in his eyes. He stepped back, moving toward the door of the farmhouse, and for a split second, the facade of hospitality disappeared completely. "There's nothing in there for you," he spat, his voice low and laced with a sudden edge. "You need a warrant to come onto my property." At that moment, the air seemed to change. The polite conversation had turned into a standoff, the tension palpable. Officer Thompson, his voice calm but authoritative, responded, "What we have here, Mr. Mercer, is probable cause. We've heard a human cry coming from inside your house, and your dog is indicating that something is wrong." Sarah's heart jumped at those words. A human cry. They had heard it too. They were getting closer. She pressed herself closer to the crack in the window, desperate to hear more. Hank's eyes darted between the officers, his hand tightening around the shotgun he had been holding casually at his side. For a moment, the officers stood frozen, but it was clear that Hank wasn't going to let them step foot on his property without a fight. Just as the situation seemed ready to escalate, Drake lunged forward with surprising force. The German Shepherd had had enough of standing still. The leash snapped from Thompson's hand as the dog bolted toward the farmhouse, his body coiling and releasing in perfect synchronization with his command to act. The urgency in the dog's movements was unmistakable. This wasn't just an exercise anymore. This was real. "Drake!" Officer Thompson shouted, but it was too late. The dog was already clearing the low fence that surrounded the farmhouse, his paws hitting the ground with purpose as he charged toward the front door, his barking reaching a fever pitch. In an instant, Hank's demeanor shifted again. His hand gripped the shotgun tighter, and he swung it toward Drake. But before Hank could raise the weapon, Thompson had already drawn his service weapon, pointing it directly at Hank. "Drop the weapon, Mercer," Thompson commanded, his voice steady but filled with authority. Now, the situation was spiraling out of control, but the officer's training had kicked in. Hank, his face a twisted mask of rage and panic, hesitated. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The shotgun wavered in his hand as he weighed his options. The air was thick with tension, but just as quickly as the danger had escalated, Hank's shoulders slumped, his resistance crumbling. With a curse, he dropped the shotgun to the ground and raised his hands. "This is private property," Hank yelled, his voice trembling. But the fight had left him. The officers moved quickly, with Officer Thompson advancing cautiously and placing handcuffs on Hank's wrists. Meanwhile, Drake had reached the front porch, pawing furiously at the door, barking with desperate urgency. It was as though the dog knew exactly what was behind that door, what Sarah had endured in silence for so long. The dog's powerful body was no longer just a train machine. It was a symbol of hope. He wasn't just a canine officer. He was her lifeline. Officer Chen moved toward the farmhouse, her weapon drawn, eyes scanning the neglected building. The windows were boarded up, the siding was worn, and the place seemed suffocated by years of abandonment and cruelty. "Montana State Police," She called out, her voice firm but compassionate. "Is anyone inside? Can you hear me?" Inside the house, Sarah could hardly believe what was happening. The front door was secured with multiple locks, and she could hear the sound of the officers trying to gain entry. She pressed her ear against the wall, her body weak from years of captivity, but her spirit soaring with the possibility of freedom. She didn't hesitate. "Help!" she screamed, her voice raw and unfamiliar after years of silence. "Please help me. I'm locked in." The final freedom. The sound of Sarah's voice, raw and desperate, echoed through the walls of the farmhouse. It was a cry for help, one that had been silenced for too long. Officer Chen's heart raced as she heard Sarah's plea from inside. She glanced at Officer Thompson, who was securing Hank, his eyes filled with grim determination. "We're coming for you," Officer Chen called out, her voice firm, though she knew there wasn't a moment to waste. She gestured toward the window Drake had been barking at relentlessly. The dog was still at the front door, his body trembling with energy as he paced back and forth, unwilling to leave Sarah's side. It was clear to everyone now that the dog had already formed a bond with the woman inside, a bond forged by his instincts and unwavering loyalty. Behind them, the sound of sirens grew louder as backup officers began arriving at the scene. The air around the farmhouse was thick with tension, but it was also filled with hope that Sarah, after all this time, would finally be free. Drake's barking reached a fever pitch, his paws pounding against the door with unrelenting urgency. Officer Thompson turned to one of the arriving officers, signaling him to join him at the front of the house. "We need to breach the door," he said. "Get the battering ram ready." The officers moved quickly, their actions swift and precise, their focus unwavering. The situation was becoming more and more urgent, and time was running out. Every minute that passed was a minute Sarah was trapped inside her prison, every second stretching into what felt like eternity. Meanwhile, inside the farmhouse, Sarah could hear the officers outside, their voices, their commands, their movements. For a brief moment, she felt something unfamiliar, a small spark of hope flickering deep within her chest. She couldn't believe it. After all these years of being alone, of being forgotten by the world, someone was out there fighting for her. Someone was coming to get her. She squeezed her eyes shut and took a deep breath, steadying herself. The fear that had kept her locked away for so long was slowly starting to fade, replaced by something stronger. The freedom she had once thought was unattainable was within reach. Outside, the battering ram struck the door with a resounding crash. The wood splintered under the force, and the lock gave way. The officers pushed forward, their eyes scanning the dark interior, weapons drawn but ready to help, not harm. Every officer present understood the gravity of the situation. Sarah's life was hanging in the balance, and they weren't going to let her slip through their fingers. As the door swung open, Drake shot inside like a blur of motion, his powerful legs propelling him forward. His nose twitched, his ears perked up, and with one final bark of joy, he found Sarah. She was curled up in the corner, her frail body trembling with fear, but her eyes locked onto the dog's face, and for the first time in years, she smiled. It was a smile that came from the very depths of her soul, a smile that spoke of hope, of freedom, and of the incredible courage it had taken for her to survive. Drake approached her gently, his nose nuzzling her hand with a tenderness that belied his trained canine nature. Sarah, her hands shaking, reached out and touched the dog's fur, tears streaming down her face. She had never imagined that she would be touched by kindness again, not after everything she had endured. But here it was, a rescue, not just from a man, but from the pain and fear that had held her captive for so long. Officer Chen and Thompson entered the room, their eyes soft with understanding as they observed the bond between Sarah and the dog. "We're here," Officer Thompson said gently. "You're safe now." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper as she looked up at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Thank you. Thank you so much." As the officers helped Sarah to her feet, the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade away. The wind that had once carried her screams now seemed distant, replaced by a new kind of silence. It was the silence of safety, the silence of freedom. Back outside, Hank Mercer, his hands cuffed and face a mask of fury, was being escorted to a waiting police vehicle. His property, once his kingdom of control, was now swarming with officers securing the perimeter, ensuring that he could no longer hold anyone else in fear. He had underestimated what a simple cry for help could do. A cry that had been answered not only by the law, but by the heroism of a single dog. As Hank was driven away, Sarah stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, her body still weak, but her spirit stronger than it had ever been. She glanced down at Drake, who stood beside her, his tail wagging in quiet satisfaction. In that moment, she realized that the dog had saved her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. He hadn't just helped her escape a physical prison. He had brought her back to herself. He had restored the belief that kindness and hope still existed in the world. The officers surrounded her, offering support and comfort as they led her to the waiting ambulance. The small town of Willow Creek, which had always turned its back on her, now had something to celebrate. Something that would go down in history as the day a woman was freed from her prison, thanks to the unlikeliest of heroes. As the ambulance drove away, the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting a golden light over the land. Sarah looked out the window, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on her face, and for the first time in years, she let herself feel the power of possibility. She was free, she was alive, and she would never be the same again. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.